The crystal was supposed to light up when I put my hand on it. Everyone else's had. I had watched it happen 30 times already. My whole class pulled out of a classroom and dropped into a palace that smelled of incense and old stone, lining up one by one in front of a woman called the appraiser. Her name was Vera. She would press each of us to the crystal, read whatever the light told her, and announce it to a hall full of nobles and a crown that leaned forward every time. The good ones came out first. 8 of us lit up Dragon class, which meant world scale, which meant they mattered. 10 more came out Griffin, nation scale heroes to be fed and feted. 13 were called Unicorn, promising, worth some patience. Damien, the boy who always stood at the front of every room he entered, lit the crystal so bright the court actually gasped. Dragon class Sword Saint. He soaked it up like he'd earned it in the womb. Then it was me, last. I put my hand on the crystal and it went dull, not dark, dull, like a lamp with something wrong in it. Vera looked at the reading and I watched her decide how much to enjoy this. She told the whole court my class was Hole Digger. She said it fell outside the ranking entirely. When I asked her what outside the ranking was supposed to mean, she explained, patient as a teacher with a slow child, that it meant below Unicorn, below anything, that people like me were called Goblin class as a joke, and that nothing could be expected of me as a hero. I asked her, just to be sure, whether any reject had ever turned into something worth having. She said that in all the kingdom's recorded history, not once, a failure had never amounted to anything. She said it flat, like a fact about the weather. Damien laughed, not under his breath, out loud, for the room, so nobody would miss it. He said the strange quiet one had drawn the trash, and that a hole digger belonged in a ditch instead of a throne hall, and the nobles around him found that very funny. I stood there and let it happen. That was the part I decided on. I wasn't going to give any of them the collapse they were waiting for. The tears, the begging, the pleas there must be a mistake. The crown had already moved on. No party would take me. No support, no gear, no place at any table. I was a clerical error they'd fix by ignoring. So I looked at Damien and then at Vera, and I said the only thing I had. You didn't have to say all that in front of everyone. A pause, while the hall waited to see if I'd break. And you laughed, didn't you? Damien just smiled wider. I turned it over one more time, out loud, because it was the only card left in my hand. What about the version where the reject hero turns out to be the jackpot? A hole digger's a long shot. Long shots are worth a bet. Nobody bet. I walked out of the hall on my own, past the golden ones and their golden classes, and not one of them looked up. They'd handed me a stipend on the way out, the way you'd toss a coin at a beggar to feel decent about it. I spent it on a shovel. It seemed like the one thing in that whole palace that had been offered to me in good faith. Everyone else got a legend. I got a length of wood and iron. I found a patch of dirt outside the walls that nobody wanted, spat on my hands, and started to dig. Partly spite, partly I wanted to test the sentence myself, in the dirt, instead of taking a stranger's word that I was nothing. The ground was hard. I told myself I had nothing but time, and I chipped at it, and somewhere in the rhythm of it, a strange thing happened. The work started to feel good. Then it started to feel easy. Skills arrived while I dug, one after another, a quiet voice naming each as it landed. Hole digging, earth moving, earth compaction, something dry called mindless labor, which I chose to take as a compliment. Then dark vision, then dark resistance, then confined space resistance. And I only really noticed those last 3 when I looked up and realized I couldn't see the top of the hole anymore. The entrance had vanished. I'd gone down further than I had any business going, faster than any shovel should manage, and the daylight was just a memory somewhere above my head. I could still see though, that was the odd part. The dark didn't bother me at all, so I kept going. At the bottom, sunk into the floor, something was glowing. It was a crystal, a perfect octahedron, 2 pyramids joined at the base, the size of a man's head, giving off a light that was soft and steady, and not like any lamp I'd ever seen. Down there in the dark with dirt to my elbows, it was the first beautiful thing I'd looked at all day. "It's beautiful," I said, to no one. I reached for it. I wasn't thinking anything grand. I just wanted to touch it. A voice screamed at me, not the calm one that had been naming my skills. A real voice, panicked, out of nowhere in the dark, begging me not to touch that. Too late. My fingers were already on the glass. The flat voice came back over the top of the scream, calm as a clerk. It confirmed contact with an intelligent life form. Then it told me I had been registered as a dungeon master. I didn't know what that was yet, but I stood at the bottom of a hole I dug out of spite, 100 meters under a kingdom that had spent the morning explaining to a full court that I would never be anything, and something enormous had just decided otherwise. A jolt went through me that was half fear and half the first real hope I'd felt since the crystal in the throne hall stayed dull. Then the crystal threw me backwards, and I found out I wasn't alone down there. A girl was clinging to the crystal, red hair, 2 small horns curving up out of it, wings behind her like a bat's, folded and shaking. She was crying, and the second she saw me on the floor, she was screaming that I'd stolen her place, that it was hers, that I'd ruined everything. I got up. "Can't you just give it back?" That was apparently the wrong thing to say. She flew across the room, grabbed me by the collar, and swore she'd kill me. And then she folded up mid-threat, screaming a different kind of scream, and dropped. Something had punished her the instant she raised a hand to me. She curled on the stone floor and cursed a god by name, insisting the throne had been promised to her. The calm voice explained the situation while she wept. Her name was Ada. She was a demon, killed in a war against something called the Celestials, and chosen by the Labyrinth god, the god the demons pray to, the one who runs every dungeon in the world, to be reborn as this dungeon's master, a reward for dying well. But the god had a rule, and the rule had teeth. Whoever touches the core first becomes master. It was supposed to be her. It was supposed to sit where no one could ever reach it. I dug a hole and reached it. So the honor was mine, and Ada was my vassal, bound to me, unable to lift a hand against me without that punishment folding her in half. She lay there and told me it was the worst luck in the world, 1 chance in a million, and it had happened to her, and she couldn't even kill the man it happened because of. She wanted to know why I'd been digging what I was after, 100 meters down. "I was digging a hole," I said, "and then I noticed all this." She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language, and then she started crying again. The voice, the system, it called itself, offered to show me what I'd walked into. A window opened in the air. Status, map, dungeon construction. It told me I was level 1 with 50 dungeon points, that points came in slowly over time or faster from beating anything that invaded, and that I spent them to build. The map showed the oval room around me with a little white arrow for where I stood, and running up from it, a long diagonal shaft, the tunnel, the one I dug by hand from the surface. The dungeon had counted it as its own. I looked at that line on the map for a while. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Can I expand this thing just by digging it myself? I could. That turned out to be the whole trick of it. The construction menu had rooms I could buy for points. 5 for one, 10 for the next, up the line. I bought the first just to see, and it carved a passage 2 meters long in an instant. Then I dug the same 2 meters myself with the shovel in about 10 minutes and paid nothing. Ada started to scold me for it, some speech about how she'd never in her life heard of a dungeon master widening his own lair by hand like a mole. And then she stopped because she'd watched how fast I did it, and it clearly frightened her a little. Her hole digger, doing the one thing his class was named for, was faster and cheaper than the god's own machinery. I kept the points and dug. What I bought instead of traps horrified her. I bought a light source so I could stop pretending the dark didn't bother me. I bought a toilet, a real one, door and flush and paper that never ran out, and moved it into its own little side room where the walls politely reshaped themselves to fit. Then a bath with hot water and a mirror, while Ada demanded to know what kind of dungeon this was supposed to be and why nothing I built would ever make a human afraid. "You want people relieving themselves in every corner?" I asked her, and she didn't have an answer for that, which I enjoyed. When my points ran low, the recovery was slow, until the system let something useful slip. Points come back faster the bigger the dungeon gets. So I dug more, and the digging paid me twice. New skills stacking on the old ones, cave digging, and earth removal, and earth hardening, and a direction sense. So I'd stop getting turned around, and the points ticking back quicker with every meter I opened. I built a kitchen with a 3-burner stove and a wide counter. Ada watched the whole turn into a home one comfort at a time and told me, in real anguish, that the quality of this dungeon decided her next life, her reincarnation, and I was gambling it on plumbing. Then a chime. Level 2. New functions, the system said, pleased with me. Monster creation. I opened the menu, looked at 5 creatures I could summon, and picked the cheapest one for 5 points, because I was curious and broke. A bulge pushed out of the wall and rolled free. A little white ball, soft, about a foot across, bouncing on the stone and going poo-poo. The system called it a puffkin, a rabbit thing, it said. No ability worth naming, just a weak charge. Ada shouted that it was useless, which startled the poor thing badly. I scooped it up. It was the softest thing I had ever held in my life, and I decided on the spot I wanted 100 more. I didn't get to enjoy it long. An alarm went through the whole dungeon. The map lit a red dot near the entrance, and the entrance, the system reminded me cheerfully, could not be closed, ever. One intruder in the tunnel, one master who couldn't fight, and exactly one defender, a single puffkin, currently trembling in my hands. Ada grabbed the little thing and forced it toward the danger. It didn't want to go. It froze, then bolted straight back the way it came, and behind it, chasing it up the tunnel, came a goblin. Green, ugly, child-sized, shrieking. Before it reached any of us, Ada raised a hand and the tunnel lit up with fire. When it cleared, the goblin was simply gone. She stood there breathing hard, entirely unbothered, and I realized the crying girl who couldn't stop losing had just ended a monster without moving her feet. "Wait," I said. "You can actually fight?" She snapped that of course she could, that she'd been a real demon once, and that her problem had never been power. It was being chained to a master who spent his God-given dungeon on bathrooms. The points from the kill ticked me up to 50 again. I spent nearly all of them at once, over her protests, and made puffkins until the floor was a rolling drift of white. Then I flopped into the middle of the pile. It was, without exaggeration, the most comfortable I had been since I'd arrived in that world. I told Ada she should try it. She refused, arms crossed, chin up, though I noticed her eyes kept drifting back to the fluff, and I decided not to mention it. I got hungry eventually and said I'd go up to town for food. That stopped Ada cold. She stared at me like I'd said something impossible, because it was. The system explained, a dungeon master is made to be bound to his dungeon and can never leave it, but I hadn't been made for this. I'd stumbled into it through the wrong door, an irregular master, and the rules didn't have a shape for me. I could come and go as I pleased, so could every monster I created. Ada, the one who was supposed to have this, couldn't step outside at all. I sat in the fluff a moment longer before I climbed the tunnel. That morning, a woman had told a full court, without a flicker of doubt, that someone like me had never once amounted to anything, and a boy the whole kingdom loved had laughed until the nobles laughed with him. And I was thinking about how, right now, they believed the reject had simply wandered off and vanished. They had no idea. Down here, I had a home with hot water and a kitchen, a demon who could burn a monster out of the air, more soft, ridiculous creatures than I could count, and the whole ground under their kingdom quietly turning into mine. For the first time since the crystal in the throne hall went dull, I felt like something. Not what they'd measured, something they'd never thought to measure at all, and I was in no hurry at all to let them find out. Then, I went up the tunnel to buy dinner. I'd gone up the tunnel for dinner, and I'd come back with a question. At the mouth of my hole, half in the forest light and half in the dark, I set a puffkin down on the grass past the boundary and waited for something to stop it. Nothing did. The little white ball rolled a few feet into the open, sat there squinting at the sun, and looked back at me with a soft pooh, like it wanted to know what the fuss was about. So that settled it. I could walk out of my own dungeon whenever I liked. My monsters could too. Ada could not. She'd worked out what I was testing right about the time the puffkin crossed the line, and she came apart at the edge of the dark like a kettle finally reaching the boil. Then what about me? She was already crying, which for Ada took roughly no time at all. Why is it only me who can't take one step outside? I told her I hadn't done anything to her. That did not help. Between sobs, she explained the shape of her cage. When she'd been made to become a dungeon master and then failed at it, her body had been remade for the role and never changed back. She didn't need food anymore. She didn't need sleep. And she was tied to this place by something she couldn't argue with. A proper master, she said, is supposed to be bound like that. The dungeon is supposed to keep you. Mine hadn't kept me. I filed that away and didn't say so out loud. I didn't know it yet, but that same stretch of days, far above me and a whole world away, my old classmates were sitting through a lecture in a bright palace hall. Someone was walking them through the danger ranks, how a single monster at the top of the scale can wipe a nation off the map, and how, thankfully, nothing that strong walks the world today. And then one of them asked the question everyone raised in a place like that eventually asks, is there a demon king? There had been, once, 500 years ago, and only ever once. The single most dangerous thing this world had ever put a name to. On his own, he wasn't even that impressive, the story went. What made him the end of everything was his dungeon, the largest that ever existed, a hole in the ground that birthed monsters without limit and bent every one of them to his will. They poured out of it in an endless tide, and humanity had no answer. Hero summoning was invented in a panic to fight him. The whole reason my class and I had been dragged across worlds traced back to that one dungeon whose monsters could walk out into the the daylight. I didn't hear any of that. I was standing in the dirt watching a rabbit enjoy the sun, thinking only that if my monsters could roam up top, they could herd wild things down here for Ada to handle, and every kill would feed me points. It seemed like a good plan. I got to work. The plan ran itself almost from the first day. My puffkins scouted the surface and came scampering back with something ugly on their heels. A goblin one morning, a hulking orc the next, and Ada burned each of them down before it got 3 steps into the field. The points stacked up faster than I could spend them. That first goblin pushed me to a new level and handed me a skill called Hole Warrior, whatever that was going to be worth. Somewhere in there, I caught it for the first time. A voice, right at the edge of hearing, gone before I could turn my head. When I asked the system what had spoken, it told me flatly that nothing had. I let it go. There wasn't anything to grab. With points to burn, I started making things. A fluffy dog-shaped monster padded out of the wall, a palm hound, and it sat, gave a paw, and rolled over on the first try. I made 20 of them. I sent one to win Ada over, and she announced she absolutely would not be won over while being very obviously won over. Then a small clever bird, a featherling, flew one flawless loop of the whole dungeon and landed on my shoulder like it had always lived there. Later came the tree-shaped smoke trent and a lion the size of a house cat that mewed. None of it was frightening. All of it followed me around. I opened 4 entrances to widen the net, and the prey kept coming. The traps were a disappointment to exactly one of us. I unlocked the trap menu, spent on the cheapest option, and got a soft carpet. I lay down on it and took a nap. Ada woke me and got herself scolded for her trouble. The next one was a foot mat that hurt to stand on and stopped hurting the instant you put shoes on. Ada gave up on me ever building anything lethal right around the trampoline and the sandbox. So I quit chasing traps and dug instead. That was where it got strange. Every long tunnel I carved dumped a fresh pile of skills on me. I could dig from a distance now. My grip could crack stone. I could tear along the tunnels faster than a man should move underground. And a new sense let me read the ground overhead like a map. I found a forest with a town sitting under it just by feeling for it. One of those tunnels ran straight and true for 20 kilometers before I broke the surface, all the way to a town called Redgate. Along the way, I gave the place a proper kitchen, a bath, working toilets. It stopped feeling like a hole. It started feeling like a house. I turned a room the size of a swimming pool into farmland with a wave of my hand, and it began growing food on its own. No more trips to town for dinner. And quietly, under all the fluff and the naps, a thought I kept not saying out loud got louder. They'd ranked my class dead last of 30. The single failure, Goblin class. But no failure I'd ever heard of leveled like this. Whatever Hole Digger actually was, it wasn't what they'd measured in that throne hall. I kept digging and kept my mouth shut about it. Ada watched the whole cozy operation and mourned, daily, that she'd been assigned to the least intimidating dungeon in the history of the world. The alarm told me 4 humans had walked into my dungeon. I heard them before I saw them, voices echoing down the tunnels, one of them arguing they'd come too far to turn back now. A puffkin had led them in, the way the puffkins led everything in, and they'd chased the cute little thing straight through my front rooms and out into the field, where 2 of them promptly tripped on the uneven ground. Ada didn't wait. She barked a command and loosed 2 fire arrows across the room. The tall one caught both on the flat of a sword like he'd been born doing it. The girl beside him snapped a fan open and fanned the flames apart into nothing. Then Ada drew breath for a second volley, and I finally got a clear look at the 2 faces lit up orange in my farmland. I knew them. Ada, stop. She stopped mid-word. The fire died in her hands, and I stepped out of the dark at the edge of the field into the light where they could see me. For a second, nobody moved. The tall swordsman lowered his blade a couple of inches and just stared, mouth open, like the floor had said his name. The girl let the fan drop to her side. They knew me too. Of course they did. We'd been summoned together, all 30 of us, in the same hall on the same day. They'd stood in that room and watched the crystal go dull on me. They'd watched the crown fold me up and set me aside like a chair no one needed. As far as anyone back at the palace was concerned, the failure had walked out the door after the ceremony and simply stopped existing. And here I was, not dead in a ditch, not begging at a temple gate, standing in the middle of a warm green living room I'd carved out of the dark, with a fire demon at my back and a drift of fluff rolling around my ankles, master of the whole quiet kingdom under their feet. Mason found his voice first, and it cracked when he used it. You're actually alive. So far, I said. Chloe was already crossing the field toward me, tripping again on the furrows and not caring. And when she got to me, she just grabbed on with both arms and held on hard, saying my name over and over, like she was checking it was real. I let her. It seemed important to her, and the fluffies had gone quiet. And for a moment, The room that the whole world had thrown me out of was full of people who were glad I hadn't disappeared. None of them said the word failure. That was the part that got me, standing there. Not one of them reached for it. 2 more came up the tunnel while Chloe was still hanging off me. My childhood friend Sarah, who I'd known since before either of us could read, and behind her our homeroom teacher, blustering along, and a bubbly girl named Cameron, who took one look at the room and lit up. Mason wanted to know how a discarded hero ended up running a dungeon, so I told them straight. I dug a hole. The hole turned into a dungeon. The dungeon looked at me and decided I was its master. That was the whole story. You can just make dungeons? Mason threw his hands up. That's completely unfair. I'm jealous. Chloe thought it was the most amazing thing she'd ever heard. Our teacher thought the most amazing thing in the room was himself, and swelled up to explain that a great magician of his standing would have turned a find like this into a statue and a legend by now. Everyone let that sail past. Sarah didn't celebrate. She stood back with her arms crossed, weighing every word I said, and then her eyes went to the horned girl half hidden behind me and stayed there. She wanted to know who Ada was and why she was clinging to me. I told her the truth on that too. Ada's a demon. Real horns, real tail, none of it a costume. She showed up in the dungeon looking exactly like she looks now. Ada, for her part, had gone white and was gripping the back of my shirt. You actually know these people? She whispered. They keep saying hero. Hero, those are heroes. We've been found by heroes already. I'm finished. Then, without pausing for breath, wait, if you know them, is there room to bargain? You weren't listening, I told her. I'm a hero too. A bad one, but one. That landed on Ada like cold water. It landed on Sarah differently. I watched her file it, the way she filed everything. The whole standoff dissolved the moment I called the monsters over. I told the fluffy tide the newcomers weren't a threat, and a rolling cloud of puffkins and palmhounds and featherlings poured across the field and let themselves be grabbed. Chloe shrieked and dove in headfirst. Mason folded down beside her and admitted, quietly, that this was genuinely nice. Even Sarah, guarded, arms crossed Sarah, ended up sitting in the dirt with a palmhound in her lap and the tension draining out of her shoulders. Our teacher kept demanding a turn and kept not getting one. Buried in fur, they told me how heroes actually live out here. The crown had decided summoned heroes hate being controlled, so it barely controlled them at all. They joined the Adventurers Guild, picked their own jobs, and the kingdom quietly paid for their beds and their meals and their gear. The 4 of them had become a famous party, and, Sarah said this part carefully, heroes who died didn't stay dead. A classmate named Tanner had fallen to a monster on a hunt and simply woken up again at the summoning temple back in the capital, unharmed, with nothing but the clothes he'd come into this world wearing. I turned that over while I scratched a chin lion under the chin. So that was why no one had chased me down when I walked away from the palace. It wasn't that they'd decided I was too worthless to bother with. It was that they let all their heroes off the leash, and I'd just walked a little further than most. I wasn't sure which one stung less. Eventually, Sarah stood, brushed the fur off her, and got to the reason they'd been out this far in the first place. There was a guild job going begging near a town called Ridgeton. A warband of lizardmen had thrown up a fortress across the highway a few kilometers out, and now they sat on the road strangling every wagon that tried to pass. Trade was drying up. The guild wanted them gone, and Sarah, practical to the bone, had looked at my tunnels and had an idea that made Mason grin. If you could connect your dungeon to the inside of that fortress, she said, we wouldn't have to break the walls at all. We'd just walk in behind them. I told her that at that range, I could cut the tunnel in under a day. They'd need to level up first. Lizardmen ran a good deal nastier than goblins, a proper danger rank, and this party was still green. But the digging was nothing. Cameron wasn't listening to any of the strategy. She had a puffkin in a headlock of affection and was already begging to keep it. I told her to take one. She nearly tackled me and informed the whole room I was the best. Sarah, softened all the way down now, asked almost shyly if she could have a palmhound of her own, and got the eager one that had been bouncing around her since she sat down. I whistled a featherling off a beam for Mason, and it settled on his shoulder like it had chosen him. He promised, dead serious, to take good care of it. Our teacher made a show of wanting a splendid companion befitting a mage of his rank. He went home empty-handed, stewing, and nobody felt bad about it. I only asked for one thing in return for all of it: the tunnel, the fluffies, the help. You never tell anyone about this dungeon, I said. Not the guild, not the palace, no one, ever. They swore to it. every one of them, even our teacher, after Sarah elbowed him. The kingdom had thrown me out once already. I wasn't going to hand it a reason to come dig me back up. They left the way they'd come, up the long dark toward the surface, and I watched the little pool of light swallow them one at a time. The last thing I saw was Sarah, her new palmhound trotting happily at her heel, glancing back over her shoulder at the dark with a small crease between her brows. I didn't hear what she was thinking. If I had, I might have felt the same cold thing she did, because everything she'd ever been taught said one thing plainly: dungeon monsters cannot leave a dungeon. They belong to the hole that made them, and they die if they wander out of it. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. And a fat, happy little palmhound was following her up the tunnel toward the open sky, perfectly alive, further from my dungeon with every step. There was only one master in all of history whose monsters had ever done that. She walked on into the light and didn't say his name. Neither did I. But somewhere far above us, in a bright palace hall, 30 of my classmates had just been reminded exactly what it meant. The snake hit me before I heard it move. It came out of a side cavity I'd broken into by accident, a body longer than I was tall, all muscle and open mouth, and it was already halfway to my throat. I didn't decide anything. I threw my hands up and made the motion I'd made 10,000 times against dirt and stone. The dig. The air in front of me tore. I can't tell you exactly what it looked like. There was no blade, no spell, no flash of light. There was the space where the snake had been coming, and then a sound like a bank of earth caving in on itself, and the thing dropped out of its own lunge and did not get up. A wound opened in nothing at all, and the snake fell around it and went still, clean. Nothing crossed the gap between us that I could see. I stood there with my hands still raised. The palmhound at my heels gave one baffled woof and looked up at me. "Wait," I said, to no one in particular. "Did I just do that?" An orc answered the question for me. It came around the bend squealing, big and pig-faced and fast, and I turned the same motion on it the way you'd point a finger down a hallway. It went down from a good 6 feet off. I never touched it. Nothing I could see traveled between my hand and the thing that hit it. So I did what any reasonable man does when the world drops a loaded weapon in his lap. I tested it. Up close, the strike landed like a slope giving way, heavy and total. Past a couple of meters, it thinned out to nothing at all. Bone dragged at it, and rock dragged harder. Soft ground gave easy. It was digging. It was exactly only digging. I'd just never had a thing in front of my shovel before that could turn and run from me. I crouched there in the dark, grinning like an idiot. I climbed up through my own tunnel into the daylight to check one thing, and a goblin obligingly checked it for me. It was picking through the grass over the nest, and I raised my hand and made the dig, and nothing happened. The goblin flinched, blinked at me, and went back to the grass, entirely unharmed and mildly insulted. I tried it twice more, same nothing each time. There was the rule, and it was an enormous one. Underground, in a hole, in a dungeon, the digging killed. Out here in the open air, it was a grown man flapping his arm at a goblin. Devastating on my own ground, worthless one single step off it. I put that fact away in the place where I keep the things that can get me killed, and I went back down where I belonged. Down in the dungeon, everything felt lighter, me included. I'd noticed it before and shrugged it off. Now I paid attention. On the surface, I was an ordinary man with ordinary arms. Underground, the weight seemed to have been let out of me. Quicker, stronger, sure-footed in the pitch dark. I decided it wasn't the dungeon master part at all. It was the hole digger job itself, the job they'd laughed at, quietly making me into something else the deeper I went. To be sure, I hooked an arm around Ada and lifted her clean off the floor. What? She kicked the air. "Do not just pick people up, you put me, gah!" I set her down a little crooked, and she landed harder than she'd planned. Point proven. On the surface, I could never have done that so easily. Down here, she weighed about as much as a stray thought. It turned out I wasn't the only digger either. The palmhounds tore into a wall with their front paws like it had personally offended them, thrilled to bits, and half the menagerie could do the same. So I split them. One team to fight, one team to burrow, and the dungeon grew faster than I could walk across it. Somewhere in that rush, the work started paying me in levels I didn't understand yet, and in points. And with the points, the fluffies swelled up. A puffkin ballooned to 5 times its size, a palmhound sharpened into a wolf, a featherling shot up tall as an ostrich and let me climb on its back. I opened new fields until the place grew its own fruit and its own fish, and had nothing left to want. And under the lizardman fortress, quietly, I dug one thing I told nobody about. A curved tunnel, looping wide around behind where the fortress sat, ending blind against a wall of packed earth. A back door I could open the instant I needed it. Mason's party came back down the day I finished the fish pond. Mason spotted the trees first, then the water. "There's a pond." Miles, there was no pond. There was dirt right here. Chloe was already crouched down trying to hand feed a puffkin. Sarah stood with her arms folded, reading the whole room the way she reads everything, careful and quiet. I gave them the part that mattered. The tunnels ran all the way under the Lizardman fortress now. We could come up inside it anytime we chose. Mr. Olson wanted a monster of his own. He went on about it for a while, how a rare beast at his side would finally earn him the fame and the admiring looks a man of his talents was so plainly owed around town. I let him run out of breath and I told him no. He did not take it with any grace at all. Sarah laid out the plan the guild wanted. 100-odd lizardmen packed into that fortress, too many to rush head on. So the idea was to strike, fall back, and bleed them down over days. Or, I said, and let it sit a second, we don't go up into their fortress at all. We open a door and we let them come down into mine. She studied me for a long moment. Explain. We built the whole thing around a corridor barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. A palm hound trotted up to the fortress mouth, made itself good and noticed, and came scampering back, with a single lizardman crashing along behind it. The corridor let that lizardman in one at a time, and no faster. Mason met the first with a single stroke, and it was over. Olson's lightning cracked down and dropped 2 more before they'd fully cleared the entrance. When 5 or 6 shoved in together, Chloe spun her fan through some quick, bright step, and the whole knot of them slowed to a crawl, and Mason walked the line and cut them down before they could close the last few feet. The wave after that, I took myself. I turned the floor under their feet into loose sliding sand, and the entire rush went down in a heap, clawing after footing that had simply stopped being there. Olson finished them from the back. Chloe stared at the collapsing sand. "Okay, where does that even come from?" "It's just soft ground," I told her. Very confusing when it decides to happen on purpose. Then the corridor filled with something a great deal bigger. The Lizardman elite came in at nearly twice the height of the rest, and when it roared, the sand shivered in its pit. Sarah's voice pulled tight. Its danger was climbing toward rank B, she warned. The sort of thing that can flatten a small town on its own. So nobody was to face it alone. Mason faced it alone. He told us over his shoulder that meeting the strong ones was the entire point of being a hero, and he charged. His sword met the elite's guard and simply stopped dead. A breath later, he was airborne, flung the length of the corridor, and an elder featherling swept in under him and caught him before the wall could. "Back," I said. "All of you, right now." We ran, and the lizardmen poured after us. 30 of them. I counted every single one on my map, strung out down the corridor in a long, hungry line. I hardened the floor behind us into ridges that snagged their feet as they came. Then I brought the party into the blind curved tunnel I dug weeks before and told no one about. It ended at a wall. Mason opened his mouth to point that out. I dropped the wall, one motion, and a solid face of earth simply stopped existing, and we spilled out into the corridor behind the entire column, at their unguarded backs. For one clean moment, not one lizardman in that line understood what had just happened. We understood it perfectly. Mason balked at striking from behind. Something about a hero's honor, half formed. Sarah cut him off flat. Righteousness that gets your own friends killed, she told him, is worse than any flank, and a genuine nuisance to everyone stuck fighting beside it. He set his jaw and went. We tore through them from the rear while the fluffies kept the elite facing the wrong way. By the time it finally turned, only 4 normals still stood at its side, and Mr. Olson called us all in behind him and let the storm go. Lightning storm took the whole corridor white. The 4 dropped. The elite stayed standing. It came out of the light still on its feet, and it was finished being led around by the nose. It hauled its arm back with the spear in its grip, and it threw. The throw went past Mason, past Chloe, past Olson. It threaded the 3 of them like they were fence posts and came flat and screaming down the corridor at the one person alive who couldn't stop it. Sarah, in the back line. No shield, no strength in her arms, her hands full of keeping everyone else standing, and nothing left over for herself. I was already moving. I don't remember choosing to. Underground, I'm fast, faster than I've any right to be, and I ate the distance between me and Sarah and put my own body in the spears line with both hands already coming up. 2 strikes, right hand, then left. 2 digs into open air in front of a spear that could have punched through every one of us in a row. The first strike caught it and cracked it off true. The second took it apart. The spear came to pieces in the air a foot from Sarah's face and rained down in fragments at her feet, and the wind of the throw alone shoved the 2 of us back a full step. If I'd missed with either hand, that wind by itself would have been the end of me. I felt precisely how thin the margin was. I've spent this whole world telling myself I don't care what any of them think, that a crown's opinion of me weighs nothing. But when the spear was in the air, there was no thought in me at all about the ceremony, or the verdict, or being seen. There was only Sarah, and the line the spear was drawing to her, and a thing in my chest that had already decided it would not allow it. I put myself in the way before I'd finished being afraid. Sarah was staring at me. I didn't have the time to stare back. "It's open," I told Mason. "Take it." Mason took it. With the spear gone and its guard blown wide open, he was inside the elite's reach before it could recover, and a fast run of blows put the thing down for good. They started to breathe again. Chloe even laughed, the shaky kind that comes right after you were sure you were finished. Then the corridor mouth filled a second time. 10 more lizardmen, pouring in over the bodies of the first. "Wait," I said. "It isn't over." And then, for the first time in their lives, they watched me work. I didn't move from where I stood. I turned the dig loose on the corridor and I dropped them one after another, as fast as I could pick the next target. The lizardman at the front, then the one crowding behind it, then the next, each one going down to a wound that opened out of empty air, with nothing at all crossing the space to reach it. No sword, no blood on my hands, just my arms swinging in the old patient digging rhythm, and the whole horde folding into the dark like a field being turned under for winter. I glanced at the map. Every last mark inside my dungeon had gone still. I lowered my hands. The corridor was quiet, and when I looked up, the 4 heroes the kingdom had ranked so far above me, the Sword Saint, the Holy Maiden, the Dancer, the Great Magician, were all looking at me like they'd never once seen me before. Mason reached me first, still heaving for breath, and asked the thing all of them were holding onto. What was that? How had I struck them like that, clear across the room, with nothing but my bare hands? I told him the truth, because there was no longer any reason to hold it. The hole digger job only works underground, in a hole, in a dungeon. Out in the open, it amounts to nothing. Down here, it's everything I have. Sarah asked me what my job level was. My what? I said. The quiet that answered me was a different kind of quiet. She asked it again, slower, and I realized she thought I was making a joke, and then realized I wasn't the confused one in this corridor. I hadn't known jobs even had levels. No one had ever told me. No one had ever put the thing you measure it with into my hand. Sarah had one. She drew a flat gray stone tablet out of her pack, the kind the king presses on his chosen heroes so they can read their own status off it, and she made me lay my palm against it. And then the whole corridor went still again, and this time, nothing was trying to kill us. The tablet read my job as hole digger and set beside it the level 21. For a moment, nobody said a single word. Then Mason said his own number aloud, low, like it had been knocked loose out of him. 15, the Sword Saint, the pride of our entire class. The boy they'd built a legend around before we'd even arrived stood at level 15, and the failure they had handed a shovel and shown the door was standing at 21. They checked the tablet twice. They were certain the thing was broken. It was not broken. Olsen took it and held it up to the glow and turned it over, hunting for the crack that would let them all breathe again, and there wasn't one. The stone said what it said. I watched the 4 of them do the arithmetic behind their eyes. Every one of them had stood in that great hall on the first day and heard the appraiser sort us like fruit. This one dragon, that one griffin, this last one a goblin-class failure, set him aside. They had believed it. Not out of cruelty, most of them. They'd simply been told what I was worth by people whose whole job was to know, and they'd had no reason to check the math. The tablet was the math, and the tablet disagreed with the crown. Beneath the level ran a long wall of skills, more than any of them carried. Nearly every one of them, some shade of digging, carving, shifting earth, hardening it, moving fast through my own tunnels, a knack that made my monsters dig as well as I did. Sarah looked from her own short handful of skills to my wall of them, and didn't seem to know what to do with her own face. Skills come, she said quietly, from doing one thing over and over until the world finally takes notice. I had done nothing but dig for weeks on end. The world had noticed, and standing there with my hand flat on that stone, I finally worked out where the levels had come from. It wasn't me at all. Every time Ada burned something to ash, every time a Fluffy finished a monster off inside my tunnels, the credit for the kill had quietly come home to their master, to me. They'd been leveling me the entire time, down in the dark, while I dug and never felt a thing. I didn't say most of that out loud. I didn't crow about it. I just stood in a silent corridor with the people who'd once watched a crown, call me the single worthless one in 30, and I let the number sit there on the stone where every one of them could read it. 21. It didn't fix a thing. Nobody handed my name back to me. Nobody said the ceremony had been wrong, but something in that room bent, and every person standing in it felt it bend. And just this once, I let myself enjoy the quiet. We didn't get long to sit with it. A bigger horde came next, 60, maybe 70, and 2 elites this time, one driving the front and one holding the rear. But I knew the ground now the way I'd just learned that number, and knowing the ground was the entire game. I cut fresh tunnels straight across their column and split it clean in 2. I struck from the flank and slipped away before they could wheel around, spiking the floor behind me so the chase tripped and stumbled and paid for every step. Palmhound scouts threaded the middle of the horde and came back to tell me exactly where both elites stood. I sent an elder featherling to dangle in front of the rear one and drag it off after itself like a dog chasing a cart. And once it was alone and away from its troops, I shaped the floor beneath it into a trampoline and let it bounce. A rank B monster, spinning helpless in the air, unable to get its feet or its spear back under it. I wore it down from there and called a pack of chin lions down off the walls to finish it, and the lizardmen who'd chased me in with it. Somewhere in the middle of all that, the number on the tablet ticked over, level 22. And one of my digging skills folded itself into something sharper, the dungeon named Whole Night. Up at the front, Mason's party brought the other elite down together. All 4 of them for the one, they admitted afterward, a little sheepish about it. Mason said I'd handled mine near enough alone, and that plainly he needed to work harder. I told him I'd only borrowed the fluffies. Then we climbed up into the fortress itself, found maybe 10 lizardmen still rattling around inside it, and cleared them out. The palmhounds put their noses to the stone and reported the place empty. It was ours. They wanted to thank me. They offered me a share of the reward, and I told them to keep it. I hadn't done it for the coin, and I didn't need the guild's paper with my name on it. Then, Mr. Olson cleared his throat and said the responsible thing. He explained at some length, that a man in my peculiar situation, a hero the palace had misplaced, sitting on a power like this one, really ought to be reported to the crown. For the record, for propriety's sake. No, I said. He started to explain it a second time. I didn't let him get there. The palace was the room where a cold voice read my name off a crystal and named me the one failure in 30. The palace was the place that handed every other kid a legend, a tablet, and a party, and handed me a shovel and pointed at the door. I owed it precisely what it had given me, which was nothing. Let them go on believing the failure had simply wandered off and died in some ditch. That story suited me right down to the ground. Mason backed me without being asked to. So did Chloe. Sarah didn't say anything at all. She was watching me, the way you watch a thing you've only just realized you don't fully understand, filing something away behind her eyes that she wasn't ready yet to put into words. I didn't ask what. I had a fortress to seal and a dungeon to get home to. The number on that tablet still hadn't bought back a single thing they took from me in that hall. It just meant that the next time somebody wearing a crown decided what I was worth, they were going to be wrong, and I'd be the only one in the room who knew it. For now, that was enough. Mr. Olson wanted to tell the palace. He stood on the churned ground above my dungeon and laid out the idea the way he laid out everything, as if the world owed him applause for having thought of it. A man of my gifts shouldn't be buried in the dark, he reasoned. Surely the crown would want to know what one of its discarded heroes had gone and built. I let him finish. Then I told him no. Not softened, not maybe. Whatever else we do, I said, we don't tell the palace. He started to argue. I cut it short by explaining what a dungeon means to people who live near one. They don't see a home. They see a hole the world's monsters crawl out of. Mine sat close enough to the capital that the first official who heard the word dungeon would think seizure, purge, panic in the streets, and every soft, fluffy thing I'd made would end up on the wrong side of it. Mason didn't like the quiet that came after, so they throw you away, brand you a failure in front of the whole court, and now we're supposed to protect their peace of mind. His sword hand kept opening and closing, like it wanted something to hold. Chloe was gentler about it and angrier underneath. The kingdom had treated a summoned hero like garbage, she said, and somebody ought to answer for that someday. I told them I appreciated the anger. I meant it, more than I could say, but I wasn't about to trade the only place that had ever been mine for a fight I couldn't win against a whole crown. That settled it. Whatever heat was in them, they loved me more than they wanted a reckoning, and one by one, they let it go. Before they left, each of them promised the same thing in a different shape. Call, and we come. Mason gripped my shoulder hard enough to bruise. Chloe made me swear I'd cook for her again. Sarah only nodded, the small nod she gave when she'd already decided something and wasn't ready to say it out loud. Then they were gone up the road toward the Capitol, and it was just me and the dirt again. Ada slid out of the shadows the second their footsteps faded, brushing at her arm like she could wipe the last hour off it. Thought they'd never leave, she muttered. The loud one in the robes had stared at her the entire time, she complained, and the quiet girl, the sharp-eyed one, had watched her the way you watch something you're reading. I told her she was imagining it. I wasn't sure I believed me. We sealed the entrance nearest the Capitol, the very first hole I'd ever put in the ground, packing it shut with earth so no stranger would ever wander down it by accident. The long corridor on the far side we left open. It felt like locking the front door of a house I still hadn't admitted was a house. I wasn't there for the part of that day that mattered most. Sarah gave me a piece of it much later, and I put the rest together on my own. She walked the road home alone, a palm hound trotting at her heel, one of mine, round and warm and breathing the open evening air, a long, long way from the dungeon that made it. And that was the thing she could not put down. Every child in this world learns one rule before they learn to read. A dungeon's monsters can never leave it, ever. They belong to their hole in the ground, and that single fact is the only reason kingdoms can stand to live beside them at all. There was one exception, one in all of recorded history, the largest domain ever ranked, an S-rank dungeon, whose monsters once came pouring up out of the earth and very nearly finished humanity for good. It is the whole reason heroes get torn out of other worlds and dropped into this one. They summoned us to answer that single dungeon, the Demon Kings. Sarah looked down at the small fluffy thing walking beside her in the daylight, outside the walls, breaking the oldest law there was, and felt the ground tilt under her. My dungeon didn't break a law like that one. It broke the same one. Whatever my cozy warren of fluff was, it belonged to the same category of thing as the worst catastrophe the world had ever barely survived. She didn't tell me, not for a long time. She just kept walking and held the little palm hound a bit closer to her chest and decided, alone on an empty road at dusk, that the secret had to hold now, no matter what it cost her to hold it. Life underground doesn't keep clock time. I'd added a few new rooms by then, a proper bedroom, this living room with a table and a sofa Ada pretended to hate and never once got off of. And mostly, I slept and woke on my own rhythm, buried to the chin in fluff. I was in the middle of exactly that kind of nap when the dungeon spoke up in the back of my head. 5 humans, inside. Ada groaned into a cushion and asked if it was those heroes barging back in already. I pulled up the map instead of answering. 5 small marks had stopped just inside the far entrance, the open one, and were creeping deeper instead of turning around and leaving. Small. That was the part that snagged on something. Anybody who walks into a dungeon on purpose walks in armed and loud. These moved like they were trying very hard not to be heard. So I sent a single puffkin up the corridor to have a look. 1 fluff ball, no rush. It never came back to report. I watched its little mark turn around on the map and come rolling home, and the 5 marks came with it, following the thing in a neat trusting line, like it had gone up there and simply made friends. I heard the puffkin first, that cheerful poo-poo, and under it a knot of small voices trying to stay quiet and failing. Then they came around the bend, and they were children, 5 of them, none older than 11 or 12 by the look, thin as fence rails, clothes worn down to threads, huddled so close they moved like one nervous animal. One little girl had the puffkin clutched to her chest like a shield. They froze when they saw me. I kept still and kept my voice low. Easy, I told them. I'm not going to hurt you, so just breathe. Are you kids out here on your own? Where are your parents? A calm one near the front answered for all of them. None of us have anyone, she said. No mothers, no fathers. Before I could find something to say to that, the tallest girl, the one who'd been holding the others up with nothing but her eyes, swayed on her feet and went straight down. The children cried out. I got a light up fast and crossed to her. She wasn't badly hurt. There was a raw scrape along one forearm, taken scrambling over something in a hurry, but the rest of it was plain enough once I looked. She was starved, days without a real meal, running the whole time, and her body had finally come to collect the debt. I asked Ada if she had any healing magic. She said flatly that she didn't. I could carry the girl up to a doctor in town, or hand her to a church. Then I thought about the world up there, the one that had a use for children like these, and it was never a kind one, and decided against every bit of it. I had something better down here, and down here, I controlled every inch of the ground. The children were still braced to bolt, so I gave them the fastest key I had, which was the truth. It's all right, I said. I'm a hero. I was summoned to this world. You're safe here now. You'd think I'd pulled down the moon. The fear cracked open into pure round-eyed wonder. A real hero, an actual one. And while they were still gaping, I whistled up the soft ones. A drift of fluffies came bumbling out of the walls and gathered the amazed children up gentle as pillows and carried them, giggling now in spite of everything, deeper into the dark toward home. I laid the girl on the sofa and pressed one of the herbs from my fields to the scrape on her arm, a green thing that grew wild down there, which I had honestly never had reason to use on a person. I half expected nothing at all. Instead, the color came back into her face like water finding a low place. And after a minute, her eyes fluttered open and found mine. There, I told her. You're all right now. She sat up far too fast, mortified to have fallen at all, and bowed from the waist. Thank you so much for saving us. My name is Sheena. The rest of them lined up and told me who they were, and I have never once forgotten a single name. Millie went next, 10 years old, cool as a riverstone, blonde, with the neat pointed ears that meant elf blood somewhere up her line. Millie, nice to meet you. Nothing more than that. The tall one with the long silver hair ducked his head. I'm Noel, barely a whisper, though the others told me later he'd been the one who put himself in front when they ran. Then a small pink-haired comet at the end threw both arms up. I'm Becca. Nice to meet you. Hero big brother. Last came a dark-haired girl, small for her age, arms crossed like she was daring me to disappoint her. I'm Maddie. I started to ask the obvious thing, how 5 kids ended up in a cave a hard day's walk from anywhere, and Sheena's stomach answered for her, loud enough to echo off the stone. She went scarlet to the ears. I looked at the 5 of them again, really looked this time. The sharp little shoulders, the clothes gone gray with wear, the way they'd eyed even the fluffies, less like toys, and more like something that might get between them and being caught again. The questions could keep. Never mind all that, I said. First, we eat. I pulled vegetables out of the fields and fish out of the water and set about cooking, which I am genuinely, cheerfully terrible at. Cut, boil, hope. But the ingredients down there were so good you could ruin them 3 separate ways and still end up with something worth crying over. I didn't know yet how literally I meant that last part. While it cooked, I sent them off with Ada to wash up. She wanted to know, loudly, exactly when minding the bath had become her job. Then, she let out the long sigh of someone who'd already decided to do it anyway, and herded them off down the corridor. A little while later, Noel came back on his own, red all the way to the ears, and confessed in a rush that he was actually a boy. I told him not to worry about it. His hair was long enough that I just assumed, and that was my mistake, not his. He said it was fine. It happened to him all the time, in the small, careful voice of a kid, braced to be laughed at, and startled to find he wasn't. They came back clean and pink and warm, and the smell of the food did the rest. Sheena hovered at the edge of the table, hands knotted together, and asked if they were really and truly allowed. Really? We can eat this? Eat all you want, I told her. Honestly, there's more food down here than the whole lot of us could finish in a year. They fell on it. Millie insisted, with her cheeks full, that she was absolutely not drooling, and Maddie calmly informed the table that she absolutely was. Becca got 2 bites in and burst into tears, the happy, confused kind, like her small body just didn't have another way to hold that much good all at once. Then, I brought out fruit from the orchard. Apples, peaches, grapes, still cold from the field. That undid the last of them. One of the little ones sobbed that she'd only had fruit a single time in her whole life, and it had tasted like nothing like this. Another just kept whispering, over and over, that she was glad she was still alive to be eating something this sweet. I found something to do with my hands and let them eat. When the eating finally slowed, I asked the question again, gently. How did the 5 of you end up all the way out here? Sheena told it plainly, the way you tell a thing you have already decided not to cry about. They were orphans, every one of them, gathered from different towns. No one's children, from nowhere in particular, and they had been taken. Grabbed off streets to be sold, loaded in together, moved like freight down a road. One night, a watch got lazy, and they slipped out of the wagon and ran until their legs gave out, and the cave had looked like a place a person could disappear into and finally be safe. She didn't give me a single detail past that, and I didn't reach for one. I just felt something behind my ribs go cold and go level, and I set it aside for later. Then Ada, who has never once in her life caught the mood of a room, chirped that of course the place was safe. It was a dungeon. What on earth did they think it was? The children went stone still. Becca had, about a minute earlier, been saying how glad she was that at least it wasn't a dungeon. I could have scrambled to cover it. Instead, I decided these particular kids had had enough things hidden from them to last a lifetime, and I told them the truth. Yes, it was a dungeon, mine. I walked them out through the heart of it, past the fields and the orchard and the water, past better than 200 fluffy things bumbling around at their work, close to 300 if you counted the ones off in the far corners, and gave them the short version of how I'd come to own any of it. Summoned as a hero, thrown out as a failure, found a strange stone in the dark while I was digging a hole out of pure spite against the whole kingdom, and woke up the master of all this. Becca clapped like it was the finest story she'd ever heard. A hero and a dungeon master, she announced to the room, as if she'd just won an argument nobody had started. To show them, I spent a little of what the dungeon runs on and pulled a palm hound straight out of the wall, and it stood up blinking and shaking and immediately tried to lick Noel's chin. And for a while, the fear was simply gone from all 5 faces. That was when the dungeon spoke up in the back of my head again. Humans, inside. Grown ones this time, come in through the very same far entrance the children had used. Every one of the 5 went white. Nobody had to say a word. I already knew exactly who it was. I told the children to stay exactly where they were, and I went up the corridor alone. I already knew, walking, more or less how it would go, and it went even faster than that. The men who had bought and hunted these children had followed the small tracks to my open entrance and pushed their way inside, and somewhere in the dark, they spotted a drift of round white puffkins and decided, being precisely the kind of men they were, that rare fluffy monsters would fetch a fortune at market. So they went to grab a few. You do not grab from this warren. A big puffkin, one of the sturdy brave ones, came out of the black at a dead charge like a battering ram made entirely of fur, and by the time I got there, the whole thing was already finished. The men were flat on the stone, out cold, blown back the length of a wagon, and there was not a mark on any of them. Not a drop of blood, just grown men laid down to sleep by something soft. I told the big puffkin it had done well. It puffed itself up twice its size and gave a smug little poo. Then I carried the men out one at a time and set them down in the grass under the open sky, and I packed the far entrance shut behind me with a solid wall of earth, exactly the way I'd sealed the other one. The nearest way back in from out there was a long, hard search away, if they ever found it at all. Nobody was following those children another single step. I went back down and told them it was over. The men were gone, thrown out, the way in buried behind them. No path left for them to reach anybody down here. Maddie eyed me sideways and muttered that I was tougher than I looked. I told her not to sound quite so surprised about it. The relief broke over all 5 of them at once, and then it turned into something I was not ready for at all. Millie set down the puffkin she'd been holding and looked straight at me and asked if she could just live here. She laid it out plain, the way she said everything. She had no family. She wasn't strong. If she went back out there, she didn't even know if she'd make it. Someone could simply take her again. But down here, it was safe. There was food. There were the baths and the sweet fluffy things, and a man who, she paused and finished it honest, who probably wasn't a bad person. For Millie, that was the largest and most dangerous thing she had ever done. She had learned, young and the hard way, that wanting a place only taught the place how to hurt you later when it decided to throw you back out. She had promised herself she was done asking anyone for anything ever again. And here she was doing it anyway, out loud, in front of everyone, asking for a home, and braced the entire time for the no she was certain was coming, because for her, it had always come. It didn't come. Becca was next. Me too. Big brother. Becca wants to stay. Then Noel, barely above a breath, if I wouldn't be any trouble. Then another small voice. Please. And last of all, quietest of all, Maddie, her crossed arms uncrossing just far enough to get the words out. I want to stay too. Ada, naturally, lost her entire mind over it. This was a dungeon, she wailed, not a nursery. The monsters were all fluff. The traps were all playgrounds. And now children on top of it? The whole place was turning into an amusement park, she moaned, very nearly in tears. And I couldn't help noticing she had already drifted over to stand between the kids and the cold, dark mouth of the corridor while she complained. I overruled her. I don't mind, I told them. You can stay. And because not one of them seemed to have any idea how to hold a gift that size, I handed them a job to make it easier to carry. In exchange, you help me with the harvest and the fishing. Deal? 5 heads nodded so hard I honestly thought they'd hurt themselves. Here is the thing I'd once been told, out loud, in front of an entire court, in a hall made of gold, that no one like me had ever amounted to anything, that there was, plainly and simply, no use for me. I had carried that sentence down into the dark and and built a whole world underneath it without ever quite managing to set it down. And now there were 5 children standing in that world who had run in every wrong direction at once, past every safe grown-up in the whole kingdom, and somehow ended up choosing me. Not a legend, not a golden class. Me and the dirt and the fluff. I walked up into town and bought 5 shovels, 1 apiece, and brought them back down, and the children set about digging out their own rooms. The dungeon earth gave way under their small hands like it had been waiting a long time for exactly them. Soft and easy and glad of the work. Somewhere far back in my skull, the quiet thing that kept track of all my digging shifted up a rung, the way it always did when the work grew and there were more hands in the ground. I didn't look at it too hard. I stood in the doorway and watched 5 kids the world had thrown away dig themselves a home in the one patch of ground that had thrown me away too. And something in my chest I'd kept shut a long time just gave, quietly, down where nobody had to see it happen. "Welcome home," I said, to no one, and to all of them. And nobody wearing a crown ever heard a word about it. The kingdom still believed its failure had simply walked off and vanished into the ground somewhere. Let them keep believing it. Down here, for the first time I could remember, the ground was full. I spent the better part of the morning standing at a clothing stall in the capital, holding up a small shirt against nothing, trying to guess whether it would fit a 9-year-old. It was, I will admit, not a good look. A grown man alone in the outer market, buying children's clothes and shoes and little towels by the armful, checking sizes against the air. Every time a woman glanced my way, I felt the need to explain myself, and every explanation I could think of sounded worse than saying nothing. So I said nothing and bought 5 of everything and prayed I would not run into a former classmate. Bralstead was built like a wheel. The palace sat at the hub, the fine districts close around it, and the streets ran outward until they reached the poor rings where I was standing. Out here, the stalls only carried plain things, gray and brown, cut so they would fit a boy or a girl either way. That suited me. Half of what I was buying was for Noel, and Noel got mistaken for a girl often enough without my help. I paid, gathered the bundles, and started back toward the gate. That was when I heard the scream. It came from a gap between 2 buildings, thin and quick, and then a woman's voice telling someone she did not have time for this. I turned in. 3 men had a woman backed against the brick, one of them with a hand clamped around her arm. She was well-dressed, dark-haired, composed in a way that did not match the situation, and she was pulling against the grip without much luck. The nearest man saw me and told me to walk away while I still could. A year ago, these 3 would have frightened me badly. Now they just look like weather. The trouble was that my strength does not work up here in the daylight. My skills only wake underground, in the dark, in the dungeon. Out on the street, I am exactly as dangerous as any other man with dirt under his nails, which is to say, not at all. So I did the only thing that costs nothing. I lied. "Let me put it plainly," I said, and let my voice go bored. "I'm a hero, summoned from another world." One of them laughed. I did not. "My class is Sword Saint, Dragon rank." I looked at each of them in turn, the way I imagined a man who could kill them would. You understand what that means, don't you? They understood. The word Sword Saint did the whole job for me. They cursed, decided the woman was not worth dying over, and slid off down the alley into the dark. I stood there in the quiet after, holding my bundles of children's clothes, and let myself enjoy the small sour joke of it. Sword Saint, Dragon rank, a grand and terrible class, and a complete invention. My real class, the one they read out over me in front of the whole court, the one that got me laughed out of my own life, is Hole Digger. Nobody has ever run from a hole digger. They only lean back and howl, but say the lie loud enough, and hardened men fold in seconds. The woman straightened her sleeve and thanked me. Then she looked at me a beat longer than the moment called for, the way you might look at a lock you were deciding whether to pick, and said she worked for a company founded by a hero. She said her name was Marlene, and she walked me to her company to thank me properly. It sat in a better ring of the city, a fat, prosperous building with the palace's blessing all over it. I stepped inside expecting a stranger's office. I got a face I knew from a classroom in another world. "Miles?" Kenny came around the desk with his arms already open. Same old-fashioned way of talking, like a swordsman 200 years out of date, poured into a boy my own age. "By every fortune, it is you." Kenny had been summoned with the rest of us. Where I got Hole Digger, Kenny drew a class called Merchant King, and a skill under it called Super Business Luck. And he had turned the 2 of them, and a pile of royal investment money, into all of this in a matter of weeks. The palace itself had funded him, the same palace that handed me a shovel. He poured wine I did not drink, and told me the whole climb, cheerful and loud. Then, somewhere in it, he mentioned what Marlene was. "Before I took her on," Kenny said, lowering his voice with relish, She was one of the finest assassins on the continent. I looked at Marlene. Marlene looked back at me, flat and calm, and did not deny a word of it. "I'm retired," she said. A small pause. "Mostly. I still get the urge now and then to simply remove a person who is in my way. I'm working on it." She said it the way another person might admit they still bit their nails. It took me a moment to do the arithmetic, and when I did, it was not flattering to me. In that alley, I had walked in believing I was saving her from 3 men. I had, in fact, saved 3 men from her. She had let me do it out of politeness or curiosity, and had watched me bluff my way through a fight she could have finished in the time it took to sigh. I decided not to dwell on that. Instead, I dwelt on something better: a trustworthy classmate, a company with the crown's own money behind it, and a supply line into the richest kitchens in the kingdom. "Turns out," I said, "I might have some good merchandise." I brought them down into the dungeon to taste it at the source. Kenny pulled a carrot straight out of my soil, brushed it off, and bit it, and his whole merchant composure fell off his face at once. "Too delicious. Is this even a carrot?" He turned it over, appalled and delighted. "It's sweet as fruit." I let him work through the rest of it: the vegetables, the orchard fruit, the fish, fresh fish, in a landlocked capital that never sees the sea, which he understood the value of before I finished the sentence. "Everything down here regrows about every 3 days and can be pushed further whenever I feel like it." By the time he reached the fish, he had stopped bargaining me down and started bargaining me up, insisting on paying a fair price for food I had offered him for free. Ada arrived in the middle of it, saw 2 hero-linked strangers standing in her fields, and went straight up like dry kindling. She wanted to know who they were and why anything smelling of heroes was being let into her dungeon, I explained. She kept bristling on principle a while longer, because that is Ada, and then she went and stood near the children instead of near me, which is how she says she has stopped worrying. The children drifted in to look at the guests. Sheena studied Kenny with great care, taking in the grave old-fashioned way he held himself, and asked me the fatal question in the clear voice of a child. Is this old man a hero too?" Kenny made a sound like a man run through. "Old man, I am nothing of the sort." "The child isn't wrong, sir," Marlene murmured, and for one moment there was almost warmth in her. Then we walked deeper, past the drift of fluffies, hundreds of them by now, puffkins and palmhounds rolling and chirping across the stone, and the warmth went out of her like a snuffed lamp. I did not understand it at the time. She told me the rest later, and this is what she said. She could read strength on sight. It was the whole of her old trade, the thing that kept her alive in it. One look at a person, and she knew, to the ounce, what they could do to her. When she had first met me up in the city, she had weighed me in half a second and filed me under harmless, weak. A soft man with a shovel, nothing to fear. Down here, that reading came apart. Somewhere past the first field, a weight had settled over her, an aura pressing down on her shoulders and her chest until she was sweating through her coat, and her hand had drifted out of pure old habit to the place a knife used to live. She thought it was the dungeon. She turned to trace it to its source the way she would trace any threat in a room. The source was me, the soft man with the shovel, walking a step ahead of her, cooing at a palmhound. She told me she stood very still and did the sum a professional does. If this man ever turned, if the mild classmate leading her through his own private paradise ever decided he did not want her here, there was nothing in her whole bloody history of tricks that would stop him. She could not have protected Kenny from me. She could not have protected herself. For the first time in years, the woman who frightened other people was quietly, thoroughly afraid. And I noticed none of it. I was showing off my carrots. The one real problem was moving the goods. Sealing the entrance shut and cracking it open again for every delivery was fine for a hermit and useless for a business. So I offered Kenny the simple version. I would connect my dungeon straight to the floor of his guild warehouse. He asked how far it was. "A long way," he said. "Too far." I told him to give me 10 minutes. I dug. Not with dungeon master power. That costs points I would rather keep. But with the mocked class itself, the one they threw me away for. The tunnel ran forward ahead of my hands, and the earth I displaced simply stopped existing, and the walls set hard and smooth behind me as I went. Kenny walked along in the dark behind me, making noises he did not have words for. Marlene walked behind him and said nothing at all, and I could feel her watching the ease of it, adding it to her sum. Under 10 minutes, like I said, and I came up against the underside of his warehouse. I raised a staircase out of the stone in one clean piece and broke up through his floor into the lamplight. These stairs were made in an instant, Marlene said, testing one with her boot, and they're solid as a keep. Kenny was somewhere past joy. A private line, no eyes on it, goods appearing under his own floor from a place nobody could find. He thanked his super business luck out loud, the fortune rolling straight to him. I let him. Privately, I wondered how much of this his luck had reached out and arranged. The alley, the woman, the whole convenient shape of it, and decided I did not mind being steered, so long as it steered here. A few days later, Kenny came down the tunnel at a near run. Miles, thanks to you, it's selling like wildfire. He could barely get the words in order. He had priced the produce high, he said, braced for a fight over it, expecting the fine houses to sniff and haggle. Instead, the capital's best chefs had tasted 1 carrot, 1 plum, 1 piece of that impossible fresh fish, and folded exactly the way 3 thugs fold at the word sword saint. Now the demand ran so far past what I could grow that he was turning custom away. I stood in my field with the children chattering somewhere behind me and let that sit. The finest tables in the kingdom, the nobles, the court, the households with the crown's own name over the door. Every one of them was, at that very moment, paying a fortune for food and calling it the best they had ever eaten. Food pulled out of the dirt of the boy they had stood up in front of the whole court and thrown away. The men who wrote me off were eating out of my hand. And the sweetest part, the part I turned over slowly and did not say out loud, was that not one of them knew whose hand it was. They had not come crawling back. They did not even know there was anyone to crawl back to. They only knew they could not do without it now. I did not gloat. There was no one to gloat at. I just felt something settle in me, cold and level and satisfied, and went back to work. To keep Kenny supplied, I showed him the new field I had already dug, a whole farm the size of a schoolyard, sitting directly under his guild, crops and fish coming up in it faster than he could sell them. He talked about rice paddies and training cooks, and a food this world had never tasted. Sheena tugged my sleeve to report the children's rooms were finished. I told her they'd done good work. Everything, for that little while, was full. That evening, I sat down alone to plan the next expansion. The domain had spread further than I ever meant it to. Fields under the guild, fields under the dungeon, tunnels threading the dark for miles in every direction. I ran through what I could still build and what it would cost me. And the honest answer was that all that digging had left me short. My points were low. I would have to earn more before I grew again. And I sat there doing quiet sums about it, the way a farmer frets over a lean season. Then the warning came. It flared up in front of me, plain and cold, in that calm voice that runs my dungeon. And it was not an offer or a menu or a price. It told me my dungeon had been connected to another dungeon. I read it twice. Another dungeon, which meant another master. Somewhere out in the dark, my sprawling, greedy, overgrown domain had pushed until it touched a domain that was not mine, held by someone I had never met, and the two had linked, and the door between them was open. I had spent so long believing I was the only strange thing under the ground, a discarded boy with a joke of a class and a farm full of carrots. I had never once let myself think about what Sarah half said to me once, about the one dungeon in all of history whose monsters could walk out of it, and the thing that ruled it, and why heroes get summoned at all. The voice did not explain. It only waited, and somewhere on the far side of that new open door, something that was not mine began to move toward the light. The voice in my head did not panic. It never did. It told me, flat and calm, that something had crossed into my domain that I had not made. I was already moving. The chin lions were running the wrong way, not toward the fields, toward me, and a fluffy only runs from a thing it cannot eat. That told me more than the warning had. Whatever came through the breach was real, and it was already inside. I kicked the sofa on my way past. Up, it's finally your turn. Ada rolled off it and hit the stone with a yelp, all red hair and outrage, and demanded to know what could possibly be worth waking her. I gave her one word: invasion. She stopped complaining after that. The voice laid the choice out plain. 2 domains had touched, and I could seal the door and hope the other master left it alone, or I could go through it, find the heart of the place, and break it. Sealing was the safe answer. It was also the answer that left 5 children asleep 3 floors above an open door. So I ran for the breach instead, and somewhere in that run, the ground stopped fighting me. My old movement skill cracked open and became something faster, something the voice named as it happened, and the tunnel started sliding past like water. Ada shrieked behind me that I was going too fast, that no one was supposed to move like that underground, and her voice fell further back with every word until it was just an echo chasing me down the dark. I did not slow down. The children were behind me. Everything I had built was behind me. Whatever was ahead of me was going to answer for coming through my wall. The far side of the breach witch was drowned. Water ran down every wall. The floor was slick. The air tasted of salt and rot, and the whole place dripped like something with a slow leak. My domain grew food and kept the fluffies warm. This one had been built to keep things wet. The first of them came around a bend in a croaking pack. Fishmen, upright, webbed, and slick. The kind of monster that is nothing alone and a problem in a crowd. They saw me and rushed. I did not let them close. I gouged the floor out from under the lead ones from across the tunnel, and the digging did the rest. And by the time Ada caught up, the way was already quiet. She arrived furious. "You ran off. Again, I told you not to do that. You were slow," I said. She called the fishmen revolting, which they were, and then a second wave sloshed out of a side passage, and she got to prove her point. Fire in a wet tunnel is an unfair fight. She burned them down before they reached us, steam boiling off the walls. And for a moment, she looked almost like the proud thing she'd been the day I bound her, instead of the girl who complained about harvest chores. "See," she said, breathing hard, pleased with herself. "You do need me." I told her the way down looked like a straight shot, the same as ours. One long throat of stone aimed at a heart. She didn't like being compared to the enemy. We went down anyway, deeper into the drowned dark, and the dripping got louder the further we went. The tunnel opened into a lake. It filled the whole chamber, black and still and wide, with broken stone platforms rising out of it like the tops of a drowned staircase. The water was where they wanted me. Every monster in this place fought better wet, and I was not about to swim into a fight I could stand above. So I crossed on the stones, platform to platform, dropping the fishmen that surfaced to grab at my ankles, Ada burning the ones that came up behind. Halfway across, the black water bulged. Something came up out of it the length of 3 men, all jaw, and it hit me before I could pick the next stone. The lake took me. Cold closed over my head. The thing had me, and it was dragging me down, deeper, into the place where it never lost, and I could feel it turning to bring those teeth around. The light went out. The pressure came down on my ears like a fist, and my lungs started counting, and every instinct I had said kick for the surface I could no longer see. Down there, blind and airless, weighed under a lake with a monster the size of a wagon coiling for the kill, I was supposed to be finished. That was the whole point of the water. It was built to be the one room I couldn't dig my way out of. I dug the water away instead, not the floor. The water. I carved it back the way I carved stone, shoving it off in every direction at once. And it went, because down here, I was still underground. And underground, there is nothing I am not allowed to move. It peeled off me in a shell. All at once, there was a dry pocket punched into the middle of the lake, a bubble of air with me standing in the bottom of it. The whole black weight of the water held off on every side, like a wall that had forgotten how to fall. My boots hit stone. I breathed. Above me, the surface hung upside down and impossible, and the monster came down through it into my little pocket of stolen air, still expecting a drowning man. It did not find one. It lunged, and I met it, and one clean strike ended it at arm's length. It went still, and the shell of held-back water forgot my name, and the lake fell in on the space where it had been and closed over nothing. I climbed back onto a platform, soaked to the bone, and the voice told me flatly that I had reached level 31. It also handed me a new trick for the way I'd kept myself dry. Good to know I could dig water. Better to know I could win up close, and not only from across a room. I'd spent so long a step removed from every fight that I'd half forgotten I had hands. Ada stared at me from the far platform like she'd never seen me before. She didn't say anything. That was new too. After the lake, I got impatient. The monsters thinned to nothing worth slowing for. Turtles, crabs, more of the croaking fish, and the core had to be at the bottom of this drowned throat, and I wanted it broken, and the children safe, and this whole wet errand behind me. So I opened up. The new speed took hold, and the corridor blurred, and Ada's voice fell behind me, the way it had at the breach, sharp, and then thin, and then gone. I should have stopped. I know that now. Behind me, the dungeon sprang the trap it had been holding. A wall of water came up the single corridor with nowhere to spill, floor to ceiling, and it caught Ada full and swept her back the way we'd come, like a leaf in a gutter. It carried her all the way to a wide chamber we'd already passed and dumped her there, soaked and spitting mad, in front of exactly the wrong person. She told me all of this later, and told it badly, so I've had to fill the gaps. There was a woman waiting in that chamber, poised, elegant, dry as a bone in a room full of water, lounging on the head of a serpent the size of a bridge. Ada knew her. They'd been rivals a long time ago, in a world neither of them talks about. 2 dukes' daughters with an old score, one who ruled fire and one who ruled water. And this one, the Wave Princess, had somehow become the master of this whole drowned place. She looked down at Ada the way she must have looked down at her 100 years ago, delighted, purring that fate was too kind, that of all the ruins to wash up in, look who it delivered. And she assumed, because why wouldn't she, that Ada was a master too. Another proud noble come to trade blows over old pride. She had no idea there was a man in her basement heading for her heart. Neither of them did. I was still running. The corridor ended at a waterfall. It came down 20 feet of black cliff into a wide pool, loud enough to swallow every other sound, mist hanging in the air like a curtain. I stood at the lip of it and knew the heart of the place was close, because something this big is only ever built to guard the last door. It dropped on me out of the spray. One of the fishmen, but grown huge, a head and shoulders above me, a great three-pronged spear in its fists, and a pack of the small ones boiling up out of the pool at its back. It roared and raised the water, and the pool stood up on its hind legs and came for me. It wanted to do to me what the last one had, drag me under, hold me down, win where it always won. It didn't know I'd already learned that lesson in the lake. When the flood took me, I peeled the water off myself the way I had before, carved out my dry pocket in the middle of the churn, and when the big one charged its spear, I dug the weapon to splinters and ended the thing point blank before it understood the pool had stopped being on its side. The rest of the pack I cleared on my way out of the water. Behind the falls, I found the door, a narrow gap in the stone, hidden by the sheet of falling water, and past it, a small round chamber, and floating in the middle of it, a crystal, an 8-sided thing turning slow in the air, throwing light on the wet walls. The heart of the dungeon. Beautiful, honestly. It seemed a shame. 2 rooms away, though I didn't hear a word of it, fire and water were tearing that wide chamber apart. Ada had cut loose. She'd shattered the serpent out from under the Wave Princess with a single focused blast and dropped her onto even ground. And the two of them had gone at it full out, flame against flood, neither giving an inch. But the air down there was thick and wet air feeds water and chokes fire, and the longer it ran, the worse Ada's odds got. The princess pressed her advantage, gloating that this was her home, her ground, her element. And Ada, backed against the wall with her fire hissing down to steam, would rather have died than admit the truth she was sitting on, that she wasn't a master anymore, that she belonged to someone, that she'd rather serve anyone alive than lose to this woman. I knew none of it. I only knew the crystal couldn't be moved and couldn't be left. So I made my decision, felt that small human tug of regret, and ignored it. I broke the core. 2 rooms away, everything stopped. The Wave Princess had her enemy beaten. The water was at Ada's throat. The fire was almost out. And after 100 years, the old score was 1 heartbeat from settled. She had won. She'd earned the right to say so. Her hand was already up for the last of it. And then her own heart broke somewhere below her, and the world turned inside out. For 1 second, and I let myself imagine this part, because Ada described her face so exactly, the Wave Princess understood everything at once. That the crystal she'd been chosen to keep was gone. That the law which had bound others to her had just, in a snap, bound her. That the master she now belonged to was not the rival in front of her, not any noble she'd feared or fought, but some faceless nobody she had never once thought about, working in the dark 2 rooms away while she gloated. Every certainty she'd stood on, her blood, her element, her right to look down, fell out from under her in a single breath, and the scream that came out of her was not pain. It was the sound of a whole life's worth of contempt turning around to face the wrong way. Then I walked in, soaked and calm, and it was just me again. I broke the core, I said, in case that wasn't obvious. Ada rounded on the beaten princess and crowed that now she'd be a vassal too, and heard, 1/2 second too late, exactly what she'd let slip. The Wave Princess seized it out of the air, vassal too, the word too. She rounded on Ada with a fury that was almost relief, spitting that the Great Flame Princess was somebody's servant as well, brought low by the same unremarkable man. Then she saw me looking and decided the man would do. She lunged. She got half a step before the bond dropped her, the same leash I'd felt snap onto Ada once. The punishment that fires the instant a vassal turns on the one who broke their core. She folded up short of me, shaking, and I understood without being told that this proud, drenched, glaring woman was now, somehow, mine. I didn't gloat. I've never had the knack for it, and there's no fun in it when the person doesn't even know your name. but I'll admit something quietly, here where only you can hear it. A long time ago, in a bright hall full of golden children, a cold voice read my class off a dead crystal and told a whole court that no one like me had ever amounted to anything, and everyone in that room agreed with their eyes. This woman would have agreed too. She'd have looked at the hole digger, the failure, the last of 30, and dismissed me exactly the way she'd dismissed everyone smaller than her for 100 years. Without a second thought, because that was her right, because that was the world working the way it was built to work. And the world's own rule, the one that let the strong keep the weak, had just reached down into this drowned place and handed her to me. Not because I hated her, because I broke the thing she stood on, and the law did the rest. The two of them fell to shrieking about which had lost more pathetically. I stood in the wreck of a dungeon that had just become part of mine, dripping, watching two demon princesses try to out-humiliate each other, and I thought, mostly, that they really did not get along. The voice caught me up while they screamed. The whole drowned place was mine now, folded into my map clean. Rivers and lake and waterfall and all, and a flood of points came in with it, more than I'd ever held at once. The monsters didn't carry over, only the ground did. I decided I could live without the fishmen. The wave princess, Amelia, Ada finally called her, spitting the name like a seed, would not stop. She raged that a man like me, a nobody, had shattered her core. She swung between fury and despair and back, and every time she turned it on me, the bond dropped her again. And every time Ada laughed, she turned it on Ada instead, and the two of them made a noise like a kettle that had learned to insult people. I gave it a while. Then I ran out of patience. Save it, I told them. We're going home. Amelia informed me, at length, that she went nowhere at a human's word. I took her by one arm and Ada by the other, and left at the speed the tunnels had taught me. They came off their feet at once and streamed out behind me, like a pair of banners, still yelling, all the way up through the breach and into my domain and across it, until I set them down in the quiet of my own base, with their hair standing on end and the fight briefly shaken out of them. Amelia went straight past fury into despair, sank down, and then, watching her, I could see the exact moment her pride refused to die, flipped clean over into something like ambition. She announced she'd build this place into something worth losing to. Anything strong enough to break her, she reasoned, had to be hiding real power. Ada told her flatly not to get her hopes up. Then Amelia actually looked at the place she'd lost to. The tidy fields, the orchards, the fish farm, the drifts of soft, harmless fluffies rolling across the floor, and the traps that were barely traps at all, more decoration than danger. I watched the last of her defiance drain out through her boots. She'd been beaten, she'd been bound, she'd been dragged across a kingdom by the arm, and it had all been done to her by this. A cozy little farm with a dog problem. She made a small, wounded sound, the sound of a proud woman realizing the thing that ruined her was somehow even more embarrassing than losing, and sank down among the fluffies in complete defeat. Amelia had been saving her points for years. I tend to spend mine the day I get them. So when her whole horde poured into me at once, it was more than I knew what to do with, and I had fun finding out. I unlocked a barrel-shaped sauna with a stone stove and a heat that could strip paint. The voice hinted it mended more than sore backs, then coyly refused to say how. I unlocked a room full of strange machines that made you stronger just by using them. I poured the rest into the monsters and leveled again, and whole new tiers of things I could make cracked open in front of me. I built the biggest new thing I could afford. Ada watched the ground bulge and sighed that it would just be another fluffy, same as always. It came up white-furred and broad and walked on two legs like a snow ape, and Ada said, "There, see? Another fluffy." But this one looked at me and waited. I gave it a long string of orders, the complicated kind. Dig here, carry that, sort those, then start again. And it did every step on the first try without a single mistake. A Yeti, clever enough to run a farm. I decided on the spot it was worth more than certain people who did nothing all day but complain. Neither princess took that well. Then the children found us, and the noise turned into the good kind. Sheena herding the little ones in to gawk at the new arrivals. Amelia caught completely off guard by a room of orphans who were not the least bit afraid of her. I stood in the middle of it and finally let the size of the thing land. My domain had grown so far, it swallowed another master whole. That was the piece I kept turning over, the piece I couldn't set down. Because a month ago, I'd have told you I was one strange boy with a shovel and a lucky hole in the ground. Now I knew there were others. Amelia was proof. A whole second dungeon, a second master, a second heart I could reach out and stop. And if there were two of us, there were more. And if there were more, then the oldest story in this world had never been a story at all. Sarah had started to say it once, and then thought better of it. The single dungeon whose monsters could walk out into the daylight instead of dying at its mouth. The reason this kingdom drags children across worlds and calls them heroes in the first place. She'd looked at my fluffies strolling out into the sun as if she'd seen a ghost, and she'd never finished the sentence, and I'd never made her. I still hadn't put the last piece where it went. I could feel its shape, and I kept not looking straight at it. Somewhere out past everything I'd built, past the farms and the orchards and the sleeping fluffies and the two princesses arguing in my kitchen, the largest dungeon in the world was still sitting there in the dark. And the only master anyone had ever truly feared, the one this whole world summons heroes to answer, was still inside it, dormant, patient, waiting for the day someone finally grew big enough to matter to it. I was starting to think that someone might be me, and here was the joke of it, the part I turned over last before I let myself sleep. The kingdom that had ranked me dead last of 30 and handed me a shovel was eating dinner tonight off my land. The finest tables in the capital, the court, the golden ones, and the men who'd branded me. They were tasting food pulled from my dirt and asking for more, and not one of them had the faintest idea whose hand was feeding them. They threw me away for being a hole digger. They gave the legends to the golden ones and the useless dirt to me. And when the thing this world fears most finally stirs, and every hero they were so proud of goes out to meet it, the only one who has quietly built something big enough to stand in the way is going to be the failure. They laughed out of the hall. They just don't know it yet. They will.